Singing Dutchman Productions. Hello and welcome to Doug's Front Porch, a podcast where I get to sit down with friends, old and new, and have honest conversations. Today I welcome Josh Brown to the front porch, an old friend who I haven't seen in a long time in person, and it's great to be able to catch up with you even though it's virtually, Josh. But thanks so much for coming on the show and welcome to the front porch.
Thanks so much for having me, and good to see you too.
So we'll tell everybody here in a minute how we know each other, but I always like to start my podcast episodes with the guest having an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about where they're from, maybe something from their childhood, where, did they have a lot of brothers and sisters, or nothing real in depth, but to give people a bit of a feel of who you are and where you come from. So Josh, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I was born in Allentown, but then raised in Emmaus. Yeah, I was raised pretty much, completely surrounded by family. My grandmother owned, a whole side of a mountain, basically. And so she divided up all of the land among her children. And so I grew up with aunts and uncles and cousins, but they were all considerably older than I was because my mom was the youngest of 10, and there's a 10-year gap between her and her next oldest sibling. So yeah.
Whenever I talk to somebody that has a childhood that's surrounded by older people, I like to talk to them a little bit about that. How did growing up around older people affect you, looking back on it now, maybe as a kid, or thinking about it now as an adult?
Yeah. It makes you kind of value, I think, some more tradition-rooted type things. There's certain bits of nostalgia that are really important to me even today. It made me, I think, because you're around a lot of old people, I think I grew up with a lot of superstition too, and a lot of the usual kind of talks that normal people don't talk about, like, medical things and all of that people are just like, what? And even my hobbies are not typically, a 30-year-old hobbies.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. But I want to ask you about one thing you just mentioned, because I too grew up among older people much more than people my own age. So when you mentioned about the nostalgia thing, could you talk just a little bit about that? What did you mean when you said that, or can you give an example?
Yeah, just certain tastes and sounds, but even bigger than that. And I think that's something that some people might lack. Like, I know that everybody, says, oh, I remember my favorite dish when I was a child, and having that, takes me back. But it's a little bit more than just that. It's the rhythm to the whole thing. It's the rhythm of life that it was then, and then I compare that to now, right? So I'm, completely distant from that home, and living, nowhere near, extended family as I was. And so there's a certain rhythm that happens to everyday life, going outside and, seeing people because they're all retired and at home, and, being invited over into their homes is just different to me. It's the senses and the smells and the tastes and all that stuff that I think everybody has. But there's also a nostalgia of the way of life as well, I think.
You
Yeah.
put into words stuff that has been rolling around in my head a lot recently. I think COVID made us slow down and pause a little bit. And I think a lot of people became somewhat nostalgic over the life that they thought we had pre-COVID, and then living through, this pandemic, and now hopefully, on the way out of it. But similar to you, I've been thinking a lot about what nostalgia is and how it pulls on different aspects of, the old, the stereotypical pulls on the heartstrings or makes you sad, but at the same time it makes you sad in a way that makes you feel good. And I think to me it's one of them, it's so fascinating what nostalgia is to each person, and how nostalgia affects each person, because it affects everybody a little differently. I try to talk to my students, my current high school students, about nostalgia, and maybe it's just that they're too young to understand it or appreciate it, or that they're growing up in a generation that nostalgia isn't even something that's relevant or on their radar. I don't know. You work with college students. I know. Do you find that to be the case too with the students that you work with?
Yeah, I think they just kind of, I think it's mostly their worldview, but it might also be a change in generation. It might be, that um, people who are seeking out education, I guess, today, um, may not have kind of the same growing up patterns. I think that they typically come from, wealthier families, and might not have that same um, rooted aspect of home that I had. And that doesn't mean that, that they were somehow deprived in any way. It's just different, right? It's no better, no worse, I guess. Just depending on the person. But I'll always try and tell them things, and I know that they roll their eyes at me because I'll say things like, you're never going to be around people your own age ever in your life again, which is, and that's why college is such an interesting part, because you're around, 18 to 21-year-olds, and that's it. And the students are just like, yeah, whatever, that's fine. It's like, it's going to be hard for you to make friends later on in life. So just, relish that time now. But that's really only something you get with hindsight, I think.
I think so too.
So
well, let's rewind a little bit. Let's talk about go back to high school, Josh. We're eventually going to find out that you are a professor of German and you have a linguistics background. But before we get to that, as a kid growing up, was language, what drew you to languages?
Yeah. Well, my grandmother, who lived with us, she spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, and she was Pennsylvania Dutch in certain ways, but wasn't Pennsylvania Dutch in other ways. So like the language thing, I think it was more rooted to her childhood and her upbringing. And so she spoke Pennsylvania Dutch really to her siblings, but not all of her siblings. And she kind of spoke Pennsylvania Dutch to her children, but not all of her children. Um, and there were certain traditions that she never did, like the Belschnickel was something that I never grew up with. I didn't grow up with, a variety of like folk customs of the Pennsylvania Dutch either. But for her, I was never really fully exposed to Pennsylvania Dutch as a language until her closest sister would come to the house and visit, and they would sit at the kitchen table. And the thing that struck me the most was the way that they talked, because my grandmother never talked much. She didn't share. She wasn't an overly, sharey person, overly emotional person. But she would sit and have these long conversations with my great aunt. And I was just like, there's a connection there that she doesn't have with anybody else. And so that fascinated me. And just the way they talked, I mean, not just the language, but my grandmother had this kind of high-pitched, warbly voice. And my great aunt Eva, her sister, had this really deep nasal voice. And as a child, it was just so comical to me to listen to these two ladies just talk. And they looked very similar. They just had these weird opposite voices and speaking this language that I didn't understand, that nobody in the household understood. And that kind of drew me in to wanting to kind of learn the language, or at least learn some words. And so my grandmother didn't have anything written in Pennsylvania Dutch. I mean, nothing, no like poetry book. It didn't interest her in the least of finding one. And there are materials, as you know, available. There have been for a long time. Um, but she wasn't interested in that kind of having those books around and things. I mean, she wasn't really a reader anyway, but she had cookbooks, and she had this tourist cookbook of like Amish cooking or something. And in the inside of it, they had pictures with the cooking words, and they had kind of the Pennsylvania Dutch terms that went along with the cooking terms. And I was so fascinated with that and made flashcards and all of those fun things. And I would have hoped that she would have, then invited me into the kitchen and cooked with her, and we would have talked in Pennsylvania Dutch. But that didn't happen either. I mean, she was someone who said no one is allowed in the kitchen when I'm in the kitchen, which is she was just a different type of grandmother, I guess. But that was kind of the first part that really planted the seed for an interest in language, in a different language, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you went to high school and then went to Millersville, did your undergraduate, and decided, well, German's what I want to do. And you really think I'm sure it wasn't just your grandmother's experience, but what else was it about German that you said, this is something I want to invest, my future in?
Yeah. And so that wasn't the deciding factor at all, interestingly. Like, to take German, I mean, the fact that I have Pennsylvania Dutch ancestry, that I was interested in Pennsylvania Dutch, that never crossed my mind at all. I didn't want to take Spanish because my sisters both took Spanish. And my brother was taking German, and I was just like, well, then I'm going to take French. And so I took French, and I went down to the guidance counselor, I think, and I said, I kind of had signed up for classes, and I said, could I fit in French and German? And she says, no, you have to pick one. And I thought about it, and there was a lady that went to our church who was the high school German teacher. And we knew her. She was a very good friend of the family and everything like that. And it was just like, well, she's hilarious. I was her, teaching assistant for Vacation Church School for years and years and years, and I adored her and just her whole kind of vibe and things like that. And so I said, I think I'll take German. And so I just decided to do German and see where it went. But it was no conscious decision because of my ancestry or anything that I knew about the language that would have interested me, that would have gotten a career or anything. It was complete happenstance.
So you studied German in high school, and then you decided, well, I'm going to take this farther and go to undergraduate at Millersville, and then you had the opportunity to study abroad in Germany. What was in a short, not in a really long answer, but what did you take away from your time abroad? I mean, that's a huge question, I know, because I did it, and I know that I could talk for hours about that. But if you were to tell somebody, like a minute dinner conversation, why, what was so great about you studying abroad, what would you say to people?
Oh, it was just the experience. I mean, just the countless experiences, like one after the next, after the next, after the next, because you're so rooted in your day-to-day life and everything that happens. And so almost every day, even there, even though there I was in a routine to some extent, every new experience was just new to me. And it was a challenge that you have to adapt to and you have to get used to. And I think that's hard for people who may not have the opportunity to go abroad or study abroad for an extended amount of time, is that it's that kind of those new experiences that you have literally every day. I mean, it's not an exaggeration.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
No,
yeah.
I agree. I agree. So the next step in your journey was off to Penn State for graduate school. At what point did you say to yourself, I want to make a career out of German? And how did you reach that decision?
It again was just like going into to undergrad. I had been planning on being a high school German teacher. And I was just like, I would love to go back to my old high school and teach German, and that would be fun, and take over for my German teacher and do that. And my advisor in undergrad um, was just like, well, you like writing these research papers an awful lot. And I do and did and do. And it's just like, I do enjoy that aspect. And so he's just like, why don't you go to grad school? And I had absolutely no idea about grad school. I mean, first generation college student, and now someone's telling me to go to grad school. Um, so he kind of, and that would be Leroy Hopkins, who and he kind of, pushed me into that direction. Now, he would have preferred to push me in the direction of comparative literature. That was his kind of thing, but it was not my thing at all. And so then I said, well, I'm mostly interested in language, so I'll do linguistics. And the German thing only probably came about because I ended up at Penn State. I think had I gone elsewhere, I applied 2 other places, and one of them was Wisconsin-Madison. And I was accepted at Madison, and I think had I gone to Madison, I would have done a PhD in linguistics rather than German, and probably done more work with like teaching English as a second language type things. But the fact then that I went to Penn State and they had a German program, and not a linguistics program for a PhD, that I was just like, okay, well then I'll just do German. But I really wasn't thinking that far ahead, really, that I was going to be a German professor necessarily. Again, at that point, when I started, I was really mostly focused on applied linguistics. So I was looking at, the teaching, how to teach a language was my main interest in research type things.
Yeah, you answered a question I was going to ask for people in the audience that have no idea what applied linguistics is, or like, if I go to college and get a degree in that, what is that? So you said it's basically how to teach a language, but what else is involved in studying linguistics to somebody that has no idea what that means?
Yeah. So, I mean, linguistics is the scientific study of language. And so anyone who studies linguistics would study all sorts of things. So they typically have a few languages that they work with, and they look at everything from the sound system to the structure, what we would call the grammar, to the lexicon, the vocab, to other things like, anything we do in language that we think of as completely just stupid to talk about, like, compliments and making requests and things like that. People study that, and do comparative research between languages too. And then applied linguistics is basically using any of that theoretical stuff and actually applying it. So, we can learn all about, where you make the vowels in your mouth, and then taking that to apply it to some situation. And the most typical application would be for teaching. So how you teach a new set of sounds to students in the best way. Yeah.
So while at Penn State, you did a lot of field work, which is typical in a graduate studies. Can you talk a little bit about that experience, especially what you did over in Big Valley? And we can tell people a little bit about where Big Valley is or what it is, please.
So Big Valley is technically the Kishokaquillis Valley, and it is in Mifflin County. It's part of the Appalachian Hill and Valley region of Pennsylvania. And it's not far from Penn State, not far at all, just, over the mountains, down 322. And it's a very narrow and flat valley. It's odd. If no one's ever been there, I encourage you to go there. It's just strange. I mean, I grew up in the Lehigh Valley, and I don't know that I guess you can tell that it's a valley, but in Pennsylvania, I think everything's a valley. Like, I think it's just kind of, you're always going over hills or going down. I don't know. It's very different than here in the upper Midwest, where I know I live in the Chippewa Valley, but we don't have hills. So I don't know how that works out either. But when you're in Big Valley, you're in a valley. Like, you see a mountain on one side, a mountain on another, and then there's like a flat 2-mile basin to that, and that's pretty much the valley. And so and that contributes to a number of things. And one of the big things that I think that contributes to is the fact that there was an initial Amish settlement there, and over time that Amish settlement has split into a number of different Anabaptist groups. So there are all types of Amish that live there. There are all types of Mennonites that live there, in addition to non-Anabaptists as well.
And what were you studying over there, or trying to figure out?
Yeah, so we worked in partnership with the um, the Belleville Mennonite Heritage Center. So Belleville is the biggest town in Big Valley, and the Mennonite Heritage Center, which is right downtown, the director of it was looking to record people's life stories, because these people were dying, they were getting older and dying in her congregation, and she wanted to record them and have that be a lasting memory that was around. And so she enlisted the help of Penn State, since we were nearby. And we brought our equipment, video equipment and audio recording equipment, and got to talking to a number of these older folks. Predominantly, we focused on the Mennonites, and predominantly the Mennonites at first, for the first like 7 years. And we did a bunch of interviews. I mean, oh goodness, maybe 90, 100 interviews, something like that. About an hour to 2 hours long, just on everything. We focus a lot on change that they've seen over their lifetime. And depending on who was interviewing, they would ask more about language, or more about dress, or worship services, or hymn singings, or cars, or whatever. But we talked to a bunch of those people. And it's a resource that everybody can have access to at either at Penn State or at the Belleville Mennonite Heritage Center, because they're recorded, because they're audio recorded. You can see the person as well. I mean, that's been 20 years ago now, so all except for maybe a few of those people that we talked to are deceased now.
Can I ask you about one step in that process? I'm thinking of, from someone that has had little to no contact with plain people before. They're listening to this interview and they're probably thinking, and I think about this too sometimes. So here you are, an outsider to that community, coming up over the mountain. You come down into their valley, into their home. You have all this equipment, and you sit down. And how do you engage some of these people to open up, to talk about these things? Because traditionally or typically, a lot of the plain people are removed, or want to be removed from the regular outside world. So what challenges did you face, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah. So the people, the ones that we focused on in that first part of the actual interviewing things, they were mostly more progressive. Well, there were some conservative Mennonites as well, but no one who would be averse to having their pictures taken or be recorded or anything like that. But in a sense, still, I mean, living in a very secluded valley, and being older, they were more guarded with some of their information to outsiders, especially. But we would always kind of, I think because we had the director of the Heritage Center come along with us, and she was really the one who wanted the stuff for the Heritage Center. And she would show up with kind of their like genealogy report and give it to them. And that was really what we were interested in. We weren't interested in anything, that they would never have told anybody. We're just like, this is great for your your grandkids that come along after this, or nieces and nephews or whoever. And we would always, at least for me, I would always try to connect in some way on something that they were interested in. And you always get that after the first few questions, right? One of the most important parts, and you know this as an interviewer, I can call you a professional interviewer now. Um, is that, you don't want your own ego to take place. And by that, I mean, your own ego in terms of your own agenda. And so I was interested in getting dissertation research results, but I wanted to make sure that, if the person wasn't interested in talking about language use, I wasn't going to push language use. But if they were interested in, oh, we sang out of this hymn book when we were little, and then we decided to get this hymn book, I could still get valuable stuff from that I wanted to know. And I learned a lot too. I learned a lot about, 4-part hymn singing and shaped notes, and how to make half moon pies, and things that I never thought, life skills that I never thought I would need. Technically, I guess I don't need it. It's not really a life skill to know 4-part harmonies, but you never know. um, I kind of, as a good interviewer, just took the back seat, and just in the first few, maybe 15 minutes or so, we're just like, okay, they seem really interested in talking about this. And some of the things, took me out of my own comfort zone in talking about things, because, I don't know anything about, like raising roosters for feathers for fly fishermen, which is what somebody did. I don't even know any follow-up questions about that, really. Or, questions that were just so foreign to me that I would just kind of do my best. And that's the other big attribute of an interviewer, is just to be stupid at some parts where it's just kind of like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Tell me more about that, because I've never heard of that before. And it can go in really interesting ways, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. So you got to spend time with a Mennonite community there during your PhD dissertation times. And then since then you've done other work with among the plain people, whether Amish communities or Mennonite communities, which, is unique, of course, and as a lot of Americans at least know who these people are, but beyond that there's a lot of misconceptions, myths, stereotypes. So I want to give you the opportunity, because I have a couple follow-up questions in regards to that. The time that you've spent now over the years working with these types of people, what do you, let me start with this one. Whenever you go into contact with these people, what's something you hope to take away?
You know, honestly, one of the things that I always want to take away is some way to live life a little bit simpler. And not simpler in a negative way, but I'm always interested in, like, because I, envision myself as this homesteader, right? Which I'm not at all. But, I'm always, I would be so touched, and I have been, if someone is just like, oh my gosh, I have the best peach jam recipe. And I'm just like, I would love that peach jam recipe, or, they make the best whatever pie. And it's just like, oh, that'd be great. Or if I'm having troubles, making bread, I'm just like, I can never get rye bread to work out. Oh, just come over here. I'll show you how to do it, or something like that. So that's kind of the takeaways for me personally. I think, devoid of the research type things. I mean, the research, you get whatever data you get, and you try to, do the best you can with it. But it's more of those personal connections, right? Just recently, I was with someone, and he didn't think I knew what ground cherries were, and he was very astonished that I knew the Pennsylvania Dutch word for ground cherries, which I have no idea of the etymology. The Judakasha, a Jewish cherry. I have no idea why it's called that, but he was so astonished that I knew what they were, and then. And I was just like, well, what do you do with them other than eat them? Like, I just had no idea. And he's just like, oh my gosh, I'm making this fermented thing in the basement, and you add it to the fresh goat milk that I get. And I'm just like, well, all right, let's try it. Let's see what And, so that to me is kind of learning new ways that people live is always a nice take home, I think.
What are some of the greatest stereotypes about the plain people that are just not true from
Yeah.
from your experience?
Oh, well, the big one is taxes, that they somehow are exempt from taxes. I always get that. I teach a really large lecture course on campus about the Amish, and the big one is that they, don't pay taxes. And of course, they pay taxes, right? There's nothing about the Amish that makes them exempt from taxes. Now, that doesn't mean, for example, if it's an Amish-owned business, they may not be required by law to pay Social Security taxes. But then the added part of that is they don't collect Social Security. So, but if they're employed by a non-Amish community, they will certainly pay Social Security taxes, even though they're not collecting on Social Security. So that's one of them, that the Amish pay taxes or don't pay taxes. They certainly do. Another stereotype is that the Amish are somehow they avoid modern medicine at all costs. And that's really a misconception. I think the Amish are not as quick to go to a doctor as we are in modern America. Probably very similar to rural parts of America, where people are more reticent to go to a doctor, more rely more on complementary or alternative medicine. But there's nothing religiously that would bar them from engaging with the modern advances in medicine. And I mean, there are some very conservative groups that won't do certain things, like prolonging the life of a terminally ill patient or stopping the heart for open heart surgery. Some of the conservative groups get a little shaky on that, but that's one of the stereotypes. Another stereotype is maybe that they're stuck in like the 17th century or something like that. And I have to remind them, people didn't dress like that in the 17th century. Those ways of dressing progressed over time. And they have conveniences. Just because we don't see them doesn't mean that they don't use them, that they, people wouldn't have used it in the 17th century. It's not like they're, I don't know, creating some weird poultice at home and that they have like a large hearth fire with a spit in it or something like that. I think is the impression that people get from them. They're stuck in time. They're very much aware of where they are in time. And then that kind of leads to the last one that I'd like to talk about, is that everybody, not only do most people assume to maybe not be experts on these groups, but they assume that they know. And which is okay, because maybe they're under a false impression, but it's when they know better. And whenever someone does that, I cringe on the inside and try to get out of a conversation as quickly as possible. Because it's one of those things where they'll see someone, especially in Lancaster County, they'll see an Amish, who they think is an Amish person. Well, first of all, I mean, there are so many different types of religious groups that dress plainly in Lancaster County. If you know they're an Amish person, then, well, you must be an expert on the Amish. But they'll see them with a cell phone, and they're just like, whoa, they are not allowed to do that. Or they'll see them driving in a car, and it's just like, how are they allowed to do that? They should be punished for that. And it's just like, what in the world makes you? And, especially if it's someone who's a Christian, and I'm just like, they're Christian, you're Christian, and somehow their religion better than they do. You use a cell phone, you drive in a car, but somehow they're held up to this weirdly moral higher standard than the rest of us, and that it's our job as outsiders to police their every action, that they're not Amish enough for us or something. It's a weird thing that I hear all the time, and as soon as I hear it, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I need to leave.
So one last question in regards to the Amish and the plain people, and you already hinted a little bit at this, but I wanted to ask you, with all of the years that you've worked with these people, what have they taught you? Besides, you said, you learned a couple things about how to live a little bit more simpler, but are there bigger things like their speed of life? Has that taught you something, or how they interact with each other? Has that
Yeah,
taught you something?
yeah, yeah. Both of those things. I mean, both of those things really hit the nail on the head. Um, there's a stillness that's hard to convey when you enter an Amish home. There's a stillness to it, and it's something that a lot of people, if they go in for the first time and they're just like, something was really off in that house, I don't know what it was. And it's just like, well, there's not like, for some groups, there isn't a refrigerator motor going. There's not like a computer booting up. There's not like a Wi-Fi that's constantly on. There are, ceiling fans going, or a TV in the background, or a radio, or whatever. It's just so quiet. It's just so still. And that I wish I could replicate with, but I love my things as well, so that won't happen. But there's that stillness and quietness, and just kind of, and that permeates then through the person, I think, too. It's much more of a stillness, sit down and talk a while, rather than rushing in and rushing out. And so that's probably been, one of the biggest takeaways, is that it is that stillness in the home, but also the connections that are built in the home. I think sometimes, now I don't have children, so I don't know how this is. You have children, and I'm sure they're scheduled to death, right? I mean, like soccer practice and who knows what else kids are doing. But there's such a gentle stillness that happens. I was in a Schwarzentrooper home just a few months ago, and the Schwarzentrooper is the most conservative Amish that we have on the planet. And the husband, he had had a stroke recently, and we were talking, and we were just kind of talking about absolutely nothing. I mean, the hay harvest is what we were talking about, the hay harvest over the past few years, and wet weather and everything else. And he started kind of tensing up. And without even saying anything, his wife, who was in the kitchen, she would look in occasionally, see how he's doing, if he needed some water or anything. And she kind of saw that he was a little tensed up because he had this stroke. And so his muscles were atrophied and all sorts of things. And she came in and she engaged in this kind of ritual healing that the Schwarzentroopers do, which is called pain pulling. And you envision the pain as something physical, and you're pulling it out of the person. And she stood there next to her husband and just did this motion over his arm. And had I not known what it was, I wouldn't have known what she was doing. I thought she was just standing there, like kind of like moving at his arm a little bit. But there was just such a gentleness to the whole interaction that I could learn a lot from. I think a lot of people could learn a lot from within a household, that a lot of people don't see, I think, because you don't get that kind of intimate space a lot of times with them.
Yeah, so much you talked about there that I would love to just keep talking about, because I make this connection with it, and I get the chance to go into Amish homes from time to time. And you're right. And when you walk in, you know that you're in a different space. And I often connect it to when I would go to my grandparents' house, because yes, they had electricity and TVs and all that stuff, but the stuff wasn't always on. So you would walk into my grandparents' kitchen, and really, if they weren't talking, what you would hear was the clock ticking on the kitchen wall,
Yeah.
And that was it. And you look back on that now in the world that we live in, of course, my God,
Right.
trying to find silence, you have to seek it out. It's
it's a distinct echo of sound, like the creaking of a chair will like fill the entire space. and you're acutely aware that it's there, and then all of a sudden you're just like, that's because there's no other sound that's happening. Yeah, yeah.
Personally, I think a lot of our society needs that. We need to pull the plug on things. I'm not saying go completely Amish and get rid of everything, but even if we could take 15 minutes a day and just let's all sit down.
Right? Yeah. I mean, the Amish have vices, and they have virtues, and they have vices too, just like anybody else. They're humans. So, I always say, don't become Amish, but, just find ways in your life where you might want to, be a little bit more still with yourself.
Have you, having worked with these people for so long, is that one of your mantras or something that you actively try to do?
I'm terrible at it. I'm absolutely terrible at it. I'm huge on meditation and calming. I'm a naturally anxious person. Um, and so I try to be calm and be still, and sometimes it's great, and sometimes I'm just kind of swept up in a moment of, getting work done, and often it's self-imposed, right? Because I think a lot of that practice comes from socialization throughout your lifetime, and it's hard to go against it. Um, but and I think sometimes, we do get addicted to that busyness. Um, that's hard to escape from if you're not completely socialized in it. So I'm not perfect at it, and maybe one day I will realize that that's okay.
Well, if anybody takes anything away from this conversation, like you said, it's difficult, but let's all just find some time to just listen to the clock tick every once in a while. And you might be successful, like you said, Josh, and you might not be successful. And I
Or,
think that's okay.
you could be my parents who, have multiple TVs going on full blast because they're hard of hearing now. So, I mean, that might happen too. You never know. Just embrace who you are at that point.
There we go. That's perfect. Perfect transition. Just embrace who you are and know who you are. That's great. Well, Josh, this has been a great conversation. I like to end all of my episodes with 10 quick questions that I throw out to my guests. I think I know you, but there's a lot about you I don't know. So I'm really curious to see your response to some of these questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. What is your morning drink of choice?
Water.
Water. Are you a coffee guy at all?
No, I never drank coffee. I never did it. And then I started doing it because every grad student did it. And now all of these, German, European professors do it. And I just am not, I can't. It makes me more jittery because I'm anxious all the time. So my morning beverage is water.
That's okay. That's okay. Okay, number 2. Who is a go-to musical artist or group for you?
Oh, Dolly Parton.
She is
Dolly Parton. Yeah.
I am constantly amazed. So I've followed her my whole life and all of her various styles of music, of course. But what really surprises me is I'm working with 17 and 18-year-olds today, and they know Dolly Parton. And
Do they?
It's unreal. Like she constantly reinvents herself to a certain extent, every couple of years. And she's been really media savvy here recently, socially media savvy, and she's making herself present. And and it blows me away too, because I'll have kids that are almost predominantly listen to hip hop or, pop music too, to a certain extent. But then they'll pull out a Dolly Parton song, and I'm just like, you know Dolly Parton? And then that always engages a great conversation. But no, wonderful choice. Wonderful choice.
Although recently, I have to say, and this is the Pennsylvania Dutch connection, well, tangentially, I guess, is that there was someone, I don't know what school he was at, I can't remember, but he wrote his dissertation just recently about how he discovered Ephrata music, right? So Ephrata, the commune, the intentional community that's in Lancaster County. And that's connected to the German spiritualist movements of related Pennsylvania Dutch groups. But anyway, he found that we have been interpreting the notation of Ephrata music completely incorrectly. And so he and a group of other singers sang Ephrata music as it would have heard to the members of the Ephrata community. And it's on Spotify. It's Word in the Wilderness. And it is so oddly calming to listen to because it's strange that, and I don't know where these musical traditions would have come from because it's nothing that I would be familiar with at all. But I've been listening to that every once in a while if I need kind of a calming sound in the background. Yeah.
I'll link that in the show notes because I definitely want to check it out, but maybe the listeners will too. All right, great recommendation. We'll lead it off with a Dolly Parton song, and then we'll close with an Ephrata Cloister song.
Right, it's very different. But,
yeah, there we go. From Jolene to one of those. Yeah, that sounds good. All right, number 3. What is a movie that you can watch over and over again and it never gets old?
Oh, The Dark Crystal.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that at all.
What? Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal from like the 80s?
You know, you said Jim Henson, and now I'm making that connection, but I honestly don't think I've ever seen it.
No,
and I'm a huge Muppet fan, but
oh my gosh, you need to see it.
Okay, that's on my list.
It's like a fantasy thing, which is not my thing at all, but the Skeksis and everything. Oh my gosh, just the best movie ever. It is a great movie.
That's on my weekend. I'll put that on my weekend watch list. How's that sound, Josh?
Perfect.
All right, number 4. And you do a lot of this, so I'll be curious to see what you say. What is the last thing that you read?
Oh, for work, it's boring, right? Because I read a bunch of scientific articles and things like that. But for fun, I love Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie is like my go-to reading choice. And so the last thing that I reread Murder at the Vicarage, which is one of my favorite Agatha Christie.
Okay, there we go. I saw that there's a brand new version of The Orient Express coming out. That was an Agatha Christie. I haven't had a chance to see it. Looks good. I don't know if how true it is.
That's a Hercule Poirot, and I'm not a fan of Poirot at all. I'm more of a Miss Marple, obviously.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone has gotten that impression yet that I'm more of a Miss Marple type person.
Well, now they do. All right. Number 5. What is your favorite pizza topping?
Green olives.
Oh, good choice. I like green olives, yeah. Laying on the beach or going for a hike?
Hike. I hate the beach.
Yeah.
Unless it's like a broody, dark New England beach with rocks.
Okay.
Yeah. I do not like the heat or the Caribbean.
Yeah.
No thanks.
That's not my cup of tea either. I'm really curious about this question because I know you are a master, I'm going to put that out there. You're a master at this. You've invited me over for dinner. What are you making?
Oh my gosh.
Because I see your posts on Instagram and I see that stuff and I'm like, oh God, that looks so good.
See, it would have to be something Pennsylvania Dutch, right? And so it would have to be Pennsylvania Dutch. So we'd have to start maybe with like a chicken corn soup, I think, right? Just to kind of whet the appetite. And then probably, see, I love pig stomach.
Yeah.
And it's because everybody makes pig stomach in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, maybe instead of me just making the pig stomach, I'd have you bring over a pig stomach and we try each other's pig stomach.
There we go.
Because it's just so different and what you put in it is so different. So yeah, something like that. And then,
the big question, what are you making for dessert, Josh Brown?
Dessert. Oh my goodness, that's tough. My favorite thing to make is my grandmother's funny cake.
Well, that's delicious.
So I would probably make a funny cake.
And
Yeah.
then I'll have some coffee with it, and you can have water. How's that sound?
Right? Yeah, I know I'm totally not the donkey cake pie person that I should be, but that's just the way it is.
All right. What is a dream vacation destination for you?
Ooh. Um, hmm. I would love to go. So somewhere that I've never been, that I'd love to go and see, would probably be Japan.
Hmm.
Not Tokyo, because I'm not a fan of urban areas. Like I'm not like all the lights and the electronic-y type things, but like somewhere naturey in Japan would be lovely, I think.
I think so too. I think so too. Josh, what's something you're afraid of?
Bats.
Bats. Okay.
I love what bats do for the environment. I'm really glad that they're here, and I would love to protect them as long as I possibly can, and all of that. And I would never kill a bat or do anything to harm a bat. But when they enter my space, I irrationally, and it really is irrational. I mean, it's there was a bat at my house just over the wind as it was getting towards winter, trying to find a warm place to go, and was just like flying at the window, like around my window, and I was so terrified of it that I closed the door to that room, rolled up a towel, and stuffed the towel underneath the thing, and slept in the living room, which is completely surrounded by windows that the bat could then fly at anyway. So it's completely irrational and whatever, but I will fall to the ground and sob if there's a bat flying about me.
Okay.
But I love them for what they do,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I wish we had more of them to like eat all the mosquitoes and things. But yeah.
That's great. All right, last question. What job, other than one that you've had, would you love to have?
I would love to work in a museum or archives. I would love that. And the more that I'm in the classroom with this professory type things, maybe it's a midlife crisis. I don't know. Are you going? We're the same age. Are you going through a midlife crisis yet?
Maybe mid-career crisis or something like that. Yeah, kinda.
I'm going through a mid crisis of some sort. But I would love to come back to Pennsylvania and work in a museum or in archives or do something along that kind of vein, outside of teaching, the subjunctive to German students for eternity. But I would love that.
Well, Josh, it has been an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you again. It's been too long, and great conversation. I'm sure the audience is going to get a lot out of at least getting a little bit more knowledge about the Amish. If they take anything away, that they're not this thing that's on a shelf somewhere that we can just stand and look at. There's more to it than that. But I appreciate your friendship a lot, and hopefully we can continue to, be friends in the future and possibly work together again at some point on a project somewhere down the road. But thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And stay warm out there in Wisconsin. And hopefully, I hope that you get the chance to move back to Pennsylvania sometime soon. Because in my mind, that's home is where home is. I know, but at the same time, Pennsylvania is calling you too at some point, Josh.
We'll see.
Well, thanks so much, Josh. We'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Doug's Front Porch, a conversational podcast with your host, Doug Maidenford. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. 5 stars only, please. Follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just look for Doug's Front Porch. Also, please feel free to tell all of your friends about the show, and I'll see you all next time on my front porch.